So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to Slow Factory for doing this amazing series. I think that Slow Factory is doing really good and important work, especially when it comes to decolonizing topics and areas where conversations that have been considered challenging to traditional narratives are actually being had. That's so important for all of us to learn. And so big shout out to the Slow Factory team. Thank you for having me, and thank you to all of you for being here. So today's topic, we are going to cover greenwashing and wokewashing and why it's important to avoid both. So we're going to get into the history of greenwashing and why it's really important to make sure that we're not participating in both greenwashing and wokewashing in a way that it's hard to avoid, but these systems are actually incredibly harmful to everyone in general. So we're going to break that down, and we have some exciting things to talk about. I'm going to use some posts which you might already be familiar with in this context, and I hope to get to all of your questions and have a great chat. So in this course, we're going to define and discuss greenwashing, its history, its use in fast fashion as well, and what changes need to be done. Let's get into it. Now, wokewashing is new. Greenwashing is not so new. Wokewashing is the context of, I would say, currently brands using movements created by marginalized people in order to increase their market share. Just like greenwashing is the art of brands using environmental causes in order to increase their market share. And both are actually really bad. So this is our curriculum. We're going to first cover history of greenwashing. We're going to cover greenwashing in fast fashion. We're going to talk about what needs to change. We're going to talk about wokewashing, particularly in context to hashtag Black Lives Matter. And we're going to talk about who ultimately gets hurt by these systems. So first thing, we should define greenwashing. What is greenwashing? It's the act of socially and environmentally irresponsible corporations using green marketing and woke movements in order to continue to gain market share while still contributing to the destruction of both the environment and humanity. And when I think of greenwashing, I think of concepts that have come before my time, like racial capitalism. And that can be a class all on its own. So we're not going to brush on that too much because it's a big topic. But if you are interested in more information, I've shared a really, really great video about racial capitalism in modern day context. And it's a bunch of different professors at Yale talking about it. It's on my Patreon. I'm going to put it on public view so that anyone can access it, but you can also find it on YouTube. So let's talk about the history of greenwashing, because obviously, we see it on the internet a lot. And for some people think that it was just invented on the internet. It wasn't. It did not just primarily exist in the realm of talking about fast fashion. Greenwashing began in the 60s and 70s. So this information comes from corpwatch.org, which is a website completely and utterly dedicated to making sure that corporations don't take over our planet. And at the minute, we really, really run that risk. As the contemporary environmental movement built momentum in the mid to late 60s, newly greened corporate images flooded the airwaves, newspapers, and magazines. This initial wave of greenwash was labeled by former Madison Avenue advertising executive Jerry Mander as eco-pornography. In the year of 1969 alone, public utilities spent more than $300 million on advertising, more than 8 times what they spent on anti-pollution research that they were touting in their ads. So these companies could actually just save themselves money by doing the right thing, but why do that when you could spend a bunch of money on advertising that you're not doing the right thing, when in actuality you are doing the wrong thing, and you could probably put the research in, put the time in to reform your business so that you can be better. But that's just not how capitalism works. In the 1980s and 1990s, greenwash advertisements became even more numerous and more sophisticated in the 1970s and 1980s, reaching new heights in 1990 on the 20th anniversary of Earth Day. Now, if you grew up in the 70s, you probably remember an ad with an indigenous person crying because somebody was littering. Now, here's what you don't know about that ad. The actor used wasn't even Indigenous. And I forgot who that ad was sponsored by, but that's a very, very epic example of greenwashing and what came out of this idea that you can sort of, make an advertisement and then everybody goes, oh, we individuals should take on this power instead of corporations actually just being better, because that's ultimately what greenwashing is about. Often it's about putting the onus on the individual instead of the onus on the corporation. And now is a great time to talk about how 71% of carbon emissions come from just 100 companies. I don't have a slide for that, but that is a very, very easy to find fact on the internet. In the 1980s and 1990s, 1/4 of new household products that came onto the market in the US around the time of Earth Day 20 advertised themselves as recyclable, biodegradable, ozone friendly, compostable. So when you see biodegradable on a product, a lot of these products will not biodegrade in your backyard. Like, there's a difference between something that will biodegrade in an industrial setting, meaning that they need to be in a setting that you don't have in order for these products to biodegrade. And chances are these products aren't going to find their way back into that industrial setting. And so oftentimes when you see that something is biodegradable, there's a lot more investigation that needs to go on. So in the early 1990s, one poll found that 77% of Americans said that a corporation's environmental reputation affected what they bought. So obviously, these companies are looking and going, wait a minute, we can make more money if we just make it seem like it's environmentally friendly, even if we're completely trashing the environment. In 1985, Chevron launched its People Do advertisements aimed at a hostile audience of socially conscious people. And so you see a little thing with a little coyote. And, I will stop and say, I remember the first time I saw particularly fossil fuel greenwashing, and I didn't have a word for it. I didn't know that there was a word for this type of thing, but I might have been like in my 20s, and it was a Shell oil advertisement. It had a very palatable, worldly looking white woman, and it was documentary style, and she's like doing her thing with her cameras. It turns out she's a land surveyor, and it really made her job look super duper sexy. And like, obviously during that time, everyone was like, hashtag wanderlust, hashtag wanting to travel, hashtag wanting that exciting job. But you literally work for the fossil fuel industry and you're ruining the earth. And at the end of the ad, she was like, I'm a land surveyor. And it was like, Shell digging under the ground to get the oil. Like basically what they were saying was they were trying to get the oil while not disrupting the environment, which is so counterproductive because any way that oil is extracted from the earth absolutely disrupts the environment. Doesn't matter. And so they spent all this fancy money on this documentary style ad. Back then, I didn't know that this was greenwashing, but that's exactly what that ad was. And if it hadn't been for Shell, I probably would have thought it was for like National Geographic, which we could get into problematic nature of other industries. But that ad looked very inviting to me until I realized it was for an oil company. In the 1980s and 1990s, still going strong more than 15 years later, the People Do series is a textbook case of successful greenwashing. Polls Chevron conducted in California 2 years after the campaign showed that it had become the oil corporation people trusted most to protect the environment. What a win for them. All they had to do was spend millions of dollars to lie to all of us. Like, there is no oil corporation that is protecting the environment because fossil fuels and our dependency on fossil fuels directly hurts the environment. So like, no matter what, like these companies are not protecting anything except for their bottom line and their, financial gains and market shares. That's what's being protected. So it sure isn't the environment. Chevron's greenwash also paid off at the gas pump. Among those who saw the commercial, Chevron's sales increased by 10%, while among a target audience of the potentially antagonistic socially concerned types, sales jumped by 22%. So yeah, greenwashing does pay. No wonder the fashion industry has latched onto it. Greenwash goes global in the 1992 UN conference in Rio, when Secretary General Maurice Strong created an EcoFund to finance the event. The EcoFund franchised rights to the Earth Summit logo to the likes of Arco, ICI, and Mitsubishi Group members, Asahi Glass. BP, the world's second largest oil company and one of the world's largest corporations, advertised its new identity as a leader in moving the world beyond petroleum. It touted its 45 million purchase of the largest solar energy corporation, but BP will spend $5 billion in 5 years for oil exploration in Alaska alone. That was, of course, if anybody remembers, like the days of Sarah Palin, drill baby drill. Yeah, Alaska. Shell, the world's third largest oil company, continues its clever but misleading ad series, Profits Are Principle, which touts Shell's commitment to renewable energy sources and features photos of lush green forests. But Shell spends a minuscule 0.6% of its annual investments on renewables. In true greenwash fashion, Shell's actions do not match its words. For Earth Day 2000, Ford Motor Company announced that all corporate brand advertising will have an environmental theme. It expects to spend as much on this greenwashing as it does to roll out a new line of cars, such as global warming gas guzzler, Ford Excursion. Oh, now I'm embarrassed to have owned a Ford Focus. Monsanto, Dow, DuPont, Novartis, Seneca, BASF, and Aventis launched the Council for Biotechnology Information in April 2000. The council will spend up to $250 million over 3 to 5 years to win public approval for genetically engineered foods under the slogan, "Good ideas are growing." Now, for the record, a little bit of update, Monsanto no longer uses that name. They now go under the name Bayer because they were bought by Bayer, and the name Monsanto has bad association. And so when you see Monsanto, know that Monsanto technically no longer exists. It got bought by someone else, still exists. But you have to say, when a company changes their name in that way and has to do that amount of like cleanup, there must be bad things going on beyond the scenes. No matter what you feel about our food industries, which that is its own slow factory course, which has been covered, I think the idea that this company feels like their name has very, very negative associations says a lot about the type of business they deal in. So with all the money to be made from the fossil fuel industry, of course, the fashion industry was like, what? We can do this too? Now, depending on who you ask, you're going to hear from different people that the fashion industry is responsible for 10% of the world's global carbon emissions. You know, lately there's been a conversation about whether or not that's debatable, but at the end of the day, the fashion industry is huge and contributes in some way. And like, when it comes to the fossil fuel industry, getting our entire society off of fossil fuels is going to be a hard push. It's something I think we can absolutely do in the future, but it's something that requires a lot of system change. When it comes to what we wear and what we choose to put on our body, I'm just like, I love the fashion industry, but it should be no question that all of these systems have to change for the better. So first of all, let's define what fast fashion is. Fast fashion is producing the newest styles of clothing in a manner as quickly as possible. The speed at which fast fashion moves means that in some stores and businesses, there's new merchandise available for purchase every single day. 365 days a year. And online, fast fashion also forces us to really buy at an unnatural pace, which is something that I've been clocking the last 20 years of my time on this planet. Fast fashion is the antithesis of slow fashion or anything the fashion industry has seen before, because let's be honest, the fast fashion problem really only became a problem recently. I think we were always going to have conversations about consumption in our society, but fast fashion has really fast tracked that conversation while coincidentally aiding in global poverty and making a few people very rich. Interesting. Fast fashion is not sustainable. That's a fact. Now, the fast fashion companies of the world will totally try to debate that with you, particularly one fast fashion company. But at the end of the day, researchers, scientists, anyone you ask will tell you that these business models defy planetary limits. And so the rate in which this clothing is produced is intrinsically linked to the stress which our planet is currently suffering under. If the business model changes, it won't be as fast and it won't be as profitable. But the business model needs to change in order for any of these companies to be considered sustainable companies. So, this is a quote from the Union of Concerned Researchers in Fashion. This type of have it all environmentalism achieved through market forces and satisfying growing consumer yearnings is wholly incompatible with the reality of biophysical planetary limits. What that means is that this system is harming the earth no matter which way you slice and dice it. And when you're pushing consumers to constantly want more and feel like they need to buy more, that's a part of the process which harms. Like, this system would be less profitable if these brands slowed down. It would be a lot slower. You probably wouldn't feel the need to buy new garments every season, which all of us have possibly felt for the last 20 years. And there's a reason for that. All of that has been by design. And so when you have these big brands who are changing absolutely nothing about that particular business model, but still laying claims to sustainability, it's bullshit. What needs to change for these brands? In order for most bigger brands to become fully sustainable in their business, the business itself has to become smaller, thus making a smaller carbon footprint overall. One of the things that I see a lot of is people will use the same metrics laid out for big brands for small brands. And that is such an unfair thing, because the reason sustainability has now become a weird marketing word is because the big brands needed it. Now, when it comes to small, slow fashion brands, they weren't marketing themselves as sustainable because sustainability was built into the core of their business. A brand that has to spend a ton of money on talking about how sustainable it is doing that because they have to market themselves in that way. I see a lot of small brands being held to these same standards as the big high street brands. If you go to Bond Street, there's like particular brands that pretty much own most of London's street space. And the metrics that we set out for those brands exist because those brands tend to be significant polluters. But if you go to a small brand, a mid-sized brand, and say, well, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? When it comes to the actual numbers, that small brand is not doing the same amount of damage in any way, shape, or form. And so they might not even need those same metrics. Brands looking to improve sustainable measures will decrease the seasons in their calendar year and stop pushing so much stock on unwitting customers, as well as looking towards decreasing their general waste and upcycling previous stock instead of destroying it. Destroying unsold stock is a common practice in the fashion industry. A few years ago, Burberry got caught in their own mess when they were caught destroying and burning their old stock. And it seemed like everybody just kind of went, what? This is horrible. But what people don't know is that that was actually an extremely common practice in the fashion industry. Pretty much everyone was doing it. And Burberry was just the one that got caught. It's kind of like one of those nature programs where you see a bunch of gazelles running and the lion's going to get one of them. It was Burberry, but it didn't mean that everybody and their mother wasn't doing it. It's a practice that is probably still happening very quietly and needs to cease. But the practice only exists because of overconsumption and over manufacturing of goods. Like, if you're selling everything you make, there's no need to actually burn stuff, right? And I think part of why the burning also happens is because nobody wants to really have a conversation about exactly how much merchandise they're making. It's just how it is, because when we have that conversation and you realize the true waste that's happening with a lot of brands, that's going to be a really uncomfortable conversation for the entire world. An estimated 140 million worth, that's about 350,000 tons of used clothing goes into landfill in the UK every year. That comes from wrap.org. What doesn't go into landfill ends up being donated to charity, where only about 10% of it is sold. The rest is packed up and sent to traditionally pillaged countries in the global south, where it ruins the local economy and sits in a rotting trash mountain. For instance, Accra, Ghana. This system sucks. I don't actually say third world country. I don't know who really coined the term traditionally pillaged, because I've seen it in several places on the internet, but I tend to use that because what I find is these countries that we regularly refer to as third world countries are actually resource rich countries which have been pillaged by richer countries. They are resource rich, they are labor rich, they are countries that should actually be powerhouses in the global industries, but they're not because of exploitation and because of colonization. And so to call it a third world, or to even call it developing, we need to start questioning why we consider certain countries underdeveloped and why these systems have been underdeveloped, why these countries are in this sort of position. So we're going to talk about the end life cycle of fast fashion. Sustainability is about start to finish thoughtfulness in products. A brand can claim that certain products are sustainable, but at the rate that the brand churns out new clothing daily, they can't possibly know that product decomposes or biodegrades. So there are labs that will tell you about the end of the life cycle of your product, but it takes time and money. So if you're making a garment that you're selling for $5 or even $20, are you going to pay a science lab, thousands of dollars in order to test that product and see what it actually does in the landfill? I don't think so. And so even when brands claim that this product biodegrades, they can't really be sure of that unless they're really, really putting in the research. And when you sell products for as low a price as some of these brands do, you're not putting in that research because it wouldn't be worth it financially for you to do that sort of labor. So after natural fabrics are altered with chemicals and dyes during production, it changes the composition of the garment and its ability to decompose in a natural setting. So anything that has been heavily manipulated by the fashion industry with dye, with durability, chemicals, certain fast fashion stores, I've noticed when you go in, they have a smell about them. And one time I asked in a store why the store smelled that way, and it smells that way on certain days. And someone told me it was the chemical that they used in the store they sprayed the clothing before boxing it up for transit to keep it from getting super wrinkled. And I don't know what that chemical even does to the composition of the clothing, but it smelled like a combination of feet and pee. So, yeah. Do you believe brands who make thousands of products a day are paying for those tests to find out the end of their garment's life cycle? Because I don't. So what qualifies as a bigger brand and how will I know? So we want to look at the numbers here. I think obviously I'm someone who does a lot of work within the fashion industry. So I know these things off the top of my head. But if you're really confused and you're not sure, is this a big brand? Is it a sustainable brand? You can just look at the numbers in annual revenue and profits, and that will tell you everything you need to know. But if a brand can't guarantee their garment workers make fair wages, but they make billions for other people, that's not actually a sustainable business. Brands are notoriously secretive about the volume of products they produce, and that is on purpose. Check out the website. Are there over 1,000 clothing items being offered at once? Does this brand send a push email to you every day to buy? Systems which create billionaires are generally exploitative regardless of the charity they do and the sustainable initiatives they launch. And I truly believe that. I'm glad that our society is coming to a place where we're starting to question the concept of what it means to be a billionaire and the ethics behind that. But I think right now, people are finally starting to really wake up to the idea that within the fashion industry, there's actually a lot of billionaires. There's been this concept for so long that the billionaire boogeyman is, Jeff Bezos, which, don't get me wrong, the man looks like Lex Luthor. He's not exactly like non-supervillain of the year, but I think people need to realize that he's not the only one that you should be questioning. So now we're going to get into woke washing and Black Lives Matter. So what is woke washing? Woke washing is a relatively new term to the lexicon, but woke washing is to wokeness what greenwashing is to actual eco policies. It's problematic corporations jumping on social movements to increase market shares while changing nothing about the way their business operates. So what is woke washing? Woke washing is the NFL claiming to support Black Lives Matter after awful treatment of Colin Kaepernick. For those of you that don't know, Colin Kaepernick is an ex-pro football player, American football. I know there's a lot of Europeans on this call. And Colin Kaepernick is biracial and he is Black. And he began to see what was happening in America with police brutality, just like myself, seeing it, being outspoken about it. And as an NFL player, he did not feel good standing for the national anthem while watching Black men like himself be murdered on film pretty semi-regularly. So Kaepernick began to kneel during the anthem, and as a result, he was hated by the NFL. I mean, they did everything they could to punish him before basically pushing him out of the league. And it really shows. It really shows. However, Colin Kaepernick continued to do the work, continued to be outspoken. And today he does a lot of speaking engagements and he's involved in a lot of different organizations. However, the irony of a football league that fired someone for saying, hey guys, this is really bad, then coming on to a social message when it's considered socially acceptable and the right time to do it, it made me want to throw my phone out the window. Black Lives Matter started in 2013, but for some reason, and I don't know why, I'm still trying to figure it out, in June of 2020, all of the corporations decided that it was socially acceptable to sign on to a message that basically said, hey, it's not great to kill Black people. That's really what it is. It's not complex. Like, first we had to get past white fragility, where white people got mad because the movement had the phrase Black in it. To me, it will always be something that I feel quite raw about, because it's so weird to live in a country where people can talk about different oppressions, but for some reason, when Blackness is centered, it becomes this topic that, oh, well, why can't you say all lives matter? You can't say all lives matter because Black lives don't matter. I mean, I started talking about Black Lives Matter in 2013. I received a lot of pushback on social media. Today, I think those same people would not challenge the conversation in the same way, but that sort of challenging just continues to further oppress marginalized people. And it's horrible. It really is. Like, it is something that I think I will be annoyed about for the rest of my life, that it took 7 years for people to be like, oh, yeah, you know what? We shouldn't kill people that look like you. We shouldn't. It shouldn't be that you're afraid to drive at night as a Black person. That's kind of a bad thing. You know, it shouldn't be that your parents have to talk to you about keeping your hands on the steering wheel when you're 16 and Black. That just, maybe that's not fair. But for some reason, it took 7 years for the world to get there. But let me tell you, when the corporate world arrived, they were like, how can we make money out of this? But what many of us found is that many of the companies finally lending their support to the movement were doing it to look good on social media because their treatment of Black and brown bodies inside of their organization tells a different story. From garment workers to employees in the corporate office, many brands fell on their sword for woke washing instead of doing the work. Here's the thing. I'm a marginalized person. I'm a Black woman, first and foremost. But if you are crapping on another marginalized person, I don't want your support. I don't want you jumping onto my messages. I want you to pay your garment workers. I want you to treat marginalized women with respect and humanity and decency. And so no matter how bad the problem is, I don't want you to use my problem to make yourself look good if you were hurting other marginalized people in other spaces. And that's the problem with woke washing. Hashtag Pay Up is a campaign started by Remake World in order to hold brands to account who canceled and refused to pay for orders from garment workers and factories during the height of COVID-19. The action of these billion-dollar companies has put economically vulnerable people in a state of despair. It was a completely evil and greedy move because the factories have no power. The brands were able to walk away. Many of these brands attempted to show support for hashtag Black Lives Matter. So let's look at some of this fakery. We have up first L'Oreal. L'Oreal got very, very famous for firing their first Black transgender model. So after tooting their own horn for being such good people, for working with a marginalized person in this way, when Munroe Bergdorf, who I consider to be a wonderful leader, started to talk about racism, white supremacy, white privilege, L'Oreal ended her contract. And in doing so, they left a marginalized person wide open for internet hatred because this really blew up in the media in a really bad way. But Munroe, being the powerhouse that she is, continued to do her thing, continued to talk about racism, and continued to build a really amazing career for herself. Of course, when L'Oreal decided to come around and jump on this movement, I was not having any of it. I had already decided before I had a platform that I was not buying from this company anymore because I did not like how they treated a Black trans person. I thought that it was completely unacceptable that they got mad at her for using words like white supremacy, which is actually quite common in the conversations we have today. Just because they weren't ready for it doesn't mean that she wasn't. The video that I made calling out L'Oreal, or calling in rather, circulated the internet over 100,000 times, and L'Oreal ended up apologizing to Munroe Bergdorf. And now they work together in a capacity, which I think is really cool. Munroe is a consultant for them in regards to diversity, which I would argue is a much better position than she came in as. And that's a place where a brand actually chose to do the right thing later on down the line. However, they could have really saved themselves a lot of money and looked really good if they had done the right thing the first time around. The next one, Let's Change. That came from H&M. It is performative because they cannot, as a company, guarantee that garment workers are paid a living wage. I said, do not try and use our pain to overlook that. And they also donated $500,000 to Black Lives Matter related charities, which is great, but it's a bit chintzy for a corporation valued at $15.9 billion. Next up, we have Amazon. Amazon. They are their own show. Like I could make you a completely different class about Amazon, but let's just say all during COVID, their warehouse workers were treated with a lack of respect. And there's been a lot of heat coming down on Amazon for various employee abuses. And so once again, them jumping on this message, especially putting their employees in there, from what I know, working at Amazon is not great for the employee. I said, performative, treat your warehouse workers with dignity and respect and stop trying to use a tragedy to overlook that glaring fact. We stand for equality. Now, this came from Zara. Be very, very careful of brands that are trying to jump on momentum of a movement, but are still reluctant to say Black Lives Matter, because that's erasure, right? Like you're actually trying to profit from this moment, but you still consider Black Lives Matter too radical. Like, so what are you actually trying to do besides just lift up your own market share? Because you're not lifting me up with that. Stand up, stand beside. That is Gap at the bottom. Once again, Gap is a brand that is on the pay up list. Pay your garment workers. Don't try and come for us. Treat marginalized people fairly. Urban Outfitters, also on the pay up list. Free People, also owned by Urban Outfitters, also on the pay up list. By the way, if you want the full story about Free People, it's a real interesting one. Free People was started, I think, in the 70s or 80s by a woman who's a really big activist and still involved in activism today. And the brand itself captures all of that ethos while being owned by Urban Outfitters, which is owned by a Republican who used to give money to the anti-gay GOP. Interesting, right? So Free People, their founder, whose name I can't think of right now, got divorced from her husband, and he gained the store Free People and folded it into Urban Outfitters, which he owned. That is a story of wokewashing within itself, where something started with really great roots and is now a part of something that's essentially a corporate monster because Urban Outfitters doesn't have a great reputation. We stand with you, Forever 21. Oh my goodness. I can't even get started on the violations against this company. But once again, let's just say this is another company where they cannot use the phrase Black Lives Matter. Pepsi. Oh, lordy lord. Lordy lord. Okay, so Kendall Jenner starred in a Pepsi ad where it was riding off of the momentum of Black Lives Matter. This was actually before June. I don't remember the year that this happened, but it was supposed to be her sort of at a protest that looked like Black Lives Matter. And the cops came, and Kendall Jenner solves racism by giving this police officer here a Pepsi to drink. People were furious, and rightfully so. I was mad. Pepsi ended up pulling the ad, but Kendall Jenner got to keep all of her, I believe, $2 million of her contract. So who won there? I'm still mad at her for that. I saw on a gossip site one time that like she wiped out on a bicycle, and I photoshopped a Pepsi into her hand. Someone should give her a Pepsi. Pepsi was another company, of course, that was trying to market themselves on the momentum of Black Lives Matter. And here we go with the professional sports world. So Nike has a very problematic history with garment worker abuse. Once again, the NFL, Colin Kaepernick. And then, of course, we have New Balance. New Balance has a vice president who has now left the company, but at the time of Donald Trump being the absolute worst in his run-up on the previous election, their vice president who left the company had nerves to say that Donald Trump's policies was really good for New Balance. So that's okay that he calls Mexicans rapists and Muslims terrorists and shouts about law and order for Black people, which is a dog whistle term for like police brutality, I would say. He's good for our company. So then New Balance decided that they wanted to jump in on this. So when New Balance's vice president said that, by the way, it sparked an alt-right movement of alt-right, which I would say they're just neo-Nazis wearing New Balance. So I actually own New Balance. I don't buy them anymore. I've owned these shoes for years, but whenever someone compliments them, I use that moment to talk about why I no longer buy New Balance. One day we're going to talk about the co-opting of the entire yoga world, but that's not today. Once again, Lululemon has all sorts of labor disputes. Well, one that I know of recently within their garment workers. Ralph Lauren, this is the one that really makes me roll my eyes. Ralph Lauren dressed Melania Trump for the inauguration. There was a lot of talk with different designers about whether or not they were going to dress Melania Trump, being that Trump has a history of being racist, homophobic, xenophobic, colonialist, anything that you can think of, any marginalized group that exists, this man has insulted them. So a lot of designers of color signed a letter saying, we're not going to dress the first lady, and here's why. And Ralph Lauren dressing Melania Trump, he essentially crossed the picket line because he's a big, powerful brand. He could have actually used his power to say, here's why I'm not going to provide a dress for you for the inauguration. But he just jumped right in there. So, of course, he's saying this stuff about abhorrent acts of racism happening across America, but you don't mind when it's the president of the United States. Wokewashing by another name. Of course, there are other versions of wokewashing too. Let's say you have a brand that ensures that its garment workers are paid fairly, but upon criticism of the brand's fat-phobic approach to bigger bodies, you find that the brand has a history of 1, ripping off artists and lowballing for work, 2, using marginalized people's images in their marketing for free, and 3, allowing racism to play out in Facebook groups which support their brand. So it's one thing for a brand to say, we're very ethical in the labor that we do this, we do that. But if they're engaging in unethical practices in the day-to-day business model that they engage in, then that's not actually very ethical, is it? Ethical brands pay for labor and treat marginalized people with respect and dignity in all areas of their business. So, how do you question woke washing? Let's make it uncomfortable. Here's some questions that you can just send to a company that will really, really sort of provide them with the pushback that they need to maybe consider doing the right thing. So, what has your organization done to assist in standing up against police violence besides posting a black square and maybe donating a little bit of money? What's the ethnicity of your breakdown of your organization? Does your organization have marginalized people on its board of directors? This is a dead giveaway. How do you ensure that every worker within your supply chain is paid above living wage? What sort of social advocacy does your brand do in regards to garment workers? What do you do as an organization to promote a safe space at work for all your marginalized employees? So during the time where we saw the pushback from everyone jumping on board the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of brands during that time were found to treat Black employees in a less than okay manner. That's a woke wash as well. If people don't feel like the place where they work is a safe space, then why are you jumping on this message? You're not creating a safe space for Black people. When we talk about woke washing, it harms people. Co-opting is a huge part of white supremacy. We see it in cultural appropriation and other harmful habits. The sustainable fashion movement has been created and pushed largely by small, independent, slow fashion brands, many of which have not survived the crisis that is COVID-19. Co-opting happens in all parts of our culture, especially the arts. But how does co-opting movements harm small brands and marginalized people ultimately? So I have a really firm example of this, and this is something that happened this year, which a lot of you probably remember. In 2020, the Fashion Revolution Transparency Index ranked H&M at the top of the index. But the index itself only includes brands that make over 400 million in revenue. So most small brands are lucky to break 1 million pounds in revenue, which means there's no way of ranking every brand on earth, including those that don't need flashy titles about sustainability in order to be sustainable. But what H&M did next was truly disheartening and really grated on me. They used the transparency index to greenwash their business. In a now deleted Instagram post, H&M used Fashion Revolution's transparency index to lie to the general public about their brand. H&M, the world's most transparent brand. So one thing, being rated on the transparency index does not mean you're the world's most transparent brand in the world. They scored 75% out of some of the biggest brands. So the sweater that I'm wearing is Laura Jean. We could call the factory where this was made, and we could open all the books and score away 100% on the transparency index. However, Laura Jean doesn't make 400 million in profits a year. So she's never even going to be rated on the index because she's not a significant polluter, because she's not burning her stock. She's not involved in any of this stuff. And that's not to say that every brand on the transparency index is, but a lot of brands are, and they are the reason why the transparency index has to exist. So in calling yourself the world's most transparent brand, you're co-opting other people's labor, you're co-opting other people's work, and you're being deliberately misleading. Two, they use the hashtag sustainability when transparency and sustainability are not linked. Transparency means you opened up your books and your hand was kind of forced because of it. Co-opting of sustainability can feel comparable to Black erasure and rock and roll. Who knows the history of rock and roll? Well, if you don't know, the rock and roll musicians who are today considered the greats were inspired by, drumroll, blues musicians, Black people. However, when you look at the history books and the wealth distribution between rock stars of that era and blues musicians, history remembers white faces and doesn't remember Black ones. History is always written by the winners. So I made a highlight about this on Instagram to the tune of RJD2's Chicken Bone Circuit. Remember, sustainability, like music, is a culture. And I want to end with, where do you shop now? I think this lends itself to a larger conversation about consumption, which is always going to be the root of the problem. The truth is, we all got to stop buying so much. Learn to invest in brands and investigate brands and be suspicious. There's nothing wrong with questioning what a brand is doing. because a brand is a corporation. It's not a person. The person doing their social media is a person, but they're getting paid to do that. At the end of the day, we treat corporations like humans, and we have to stop doing that, because if a corporation were a human, it would be a psychopath. We've been treating our planet like it's an infinite resource. It's not our fault. That's the message that was sold to us. But regardless, I firmly believe the brands will only stop behaving this way when their bottom line is hit and not a second before. So a few tips I offer is to shop small. Not all ethical brands are super expensive. Have a look around. Shop secondhand. Spread your money around. The monopolies that certain brands have had has served absolutely no one. It's time to give your money to more than one brand, and think about if you really need it before you buy it. And these are things that I have to do for myself. And that's why I'm here talking to you, as someone who formerly participated in the fashion industry in a way that didn't leave me feeling great. I think that making that change has made me feel way more empowered than I've ever felt before. And I want that for you, Boo, because you deserve it. And on that note, we've reached the end, but I don't have any place to be, so I can go through and chat a bit, answer some questions. So the first question, someone said, a lot of eco-fashion brands advertise their clothing as compostable, similar to your mention of biodegrading at home of these products not being possible. Is it the same for compost? Yes, unfortunately. I don't have the hard statistics, but what I do know is the process that people put a lot of clothing through in order for it to be durable, and the different dye baths changes the composition of the product. And so I would argue that, there's very few products out there on the market that can compost in a really good way in your backyard. For instance, bamboo is a fabric that comes up a lot. People will say, oh, isn't that compostable? And the problem is, once we start treating these fabrics so that they're durable and they last a long time, you really kind of lose a lot of that natural compost. But composting in an industrial setting can be a good thing if our governments actually give us the infrastructure to do that. You know what I mean? So like right now, one of the things we're pushing in the UK is for the governments to give people more textile recycling options, because at the minute, 1% of our textiles are currently recycled. So we have more options. It'll make it easier for everyone to just be a little bit more sustainable. You know what I mean? But yeah, at the minute, I think the whole decomposing thing is it's a tricky one. And I don't have all the statistics and all the science in front of me. So that's just my two pennies, two thoughts. How much accurate visibility do you think big brands have on their inventory? Do you think tech that enables transparency and visibility throughout the supply chain is the solution? And have you seen any best practice in this area? That's a great question. And the answer is no. Brands don't want you to know how much inventory they have, because if you actually knew, you would probably be protesting in the street. It's one of those things. And actually, this was something that Fashion Revolution noted in their transparency index, that one of the things that brands remain secretive and tight-lipped about is their inventory and the volume of clothing in which they're making. There's a reason for that. How do we support bigger brands on their journey to be more sustainable without dismissing their efforts? I'm not supporting them. Quite frankly, I don't care. Like, I'm going to be really honest with you. I think that you're humanizing a brand. Again, at the end of the day, I would much rather support a brand who's already doing the right thing than wait for a big brand who has no incentive to do the right thing until they lose my money. Like, let them lose my money and then do the right thing. But I don't need to support them. I don't need to. It is not your job as a citizen to uphold the failures of capitalism. Curious about your perspective of Colin and then going to work with Nike. You know what? Cap, get your coin, because I can tell you, being a professional football player, unless you're like it's at the top of the league, you don't actually make that much money. And so what he did was essentially brave. And I'm not going to judge him for that. I think that he should get his money. That's what I think. And I also say this, when it comes to calling out people, especially in the influencer landscape for greenwashing, I don't want to see any of you coming from marginalized people when it comes to a marginalized person who works with a brand that's not great. Because what we do know is that how influencers are treated and paid is, again, a really, really not nice system where Black people are not going to be the first to be paid. White people are. And so if you want to hold someone to account for saying that they're into sustainability, but then they're over here working with H&M, don't do that to marginalized people, because we have a hard enough time getting paid. I'm never going to use my platform to drag another Black person when there are plenty of white people that get tons of money from these systems, and you can put your energy there. So really, it's no one's business who Cap gets paid from. He has done his work. He has done his job. He has amplified and put himself on the line and put his career on the line. So if he gets money from Nike, I'm happy for him. Still don't like Nike. Get your coin, Cap. Okay. I did a post analyzing the language of fashion brands' Black Lives Matter post. How do you feel about them using language like "we stand with you"? I think it's bullshit. That's what I think. I think if you can't say Black Lives Matter, then like, fuck out of here with that noise. That's you taking a movement that's not your own while still being afraid to actually sign on to the movement in a legitimate way. You can't say the word Black. So no, go away, get out of here. Like, you could say Black Lives Matter, but you are worried about the backlash that you will get from white supremacy. So you're not going to say that. Instead, you're going to try and like ride the coattails of the movement while not even signing on. It's nonsense. Is it possible to change these companies from the inside out? I just left a job at one of these companies and I'm about to start a job at another. How do you work in fashion ethically? Is it at all possible? That's a tough one. A lot of my patrons are people that work within these organizations. And I do think that I want the fashion industry to survive, but it doesn't look like any current iteration of itself. And so for a lot of these businesses, unless they can actually reform their entire business, they're not going to survive. And it's not my job to prop up a bad business that has made someone else a billionaire while shitting on people in another part of the world. And so to me, I think when we all start to really support and champion ethical companies, and those ethical companies grow, and there's more work opportunities, that's when we actually challenge this landscape. But changing these systems from the inside, when like the system running in an exploitative way is exactly how the system was built to be, I think that's a hard one. You know, I think you have your work cut out for you. How do you feel when it comes to working employment? If you work in the fashion beauty industries and there aren't many options for opportunities to work for a truly ethical, okay, so I just think you have to get paid. Like, listen, I'm not here to make anyone feel bad about their place of employment. I used to work in the entertainment industry. It's kind of evil, you know? So like, we all have to keep the lights on. But I think thinking about what sort of long-term career you want to build and what you want your legacy to be, I think is more important than like that one job you have that you don't feel 150% about, because we've all had to do it. I've worked for some places that I am truly ashamed to be linked to. So like, I'm not here to judge you, but think about your long-term legacy and what you actually want out of your career and like what you want your next move to be. Aja, for sustainable brands, in this case owned by two women of color who don't have the corporate marketing budget, do you have any advice? Instagram and the algorithm have really been a fail. Here's the secret for you small brands out here. Unless you pay for advertisement and you are listed as a brand, Instagram will hide your stuff. They do that. Every brand knows that. So even if you just put 10 pounds a week into, you know, a little bit of marketing, I think that that is going to help you with that, because otherwise you're not going to get shown on Instagram, and they do that on purpose and it sucks. But like, that's something that a lot of people know. You really have to. And this is also why I tell people, because someone said to me, oh, I really hate when sustainable and ethical brands advertise to me on Instagram. And I'm like, okay, but the reason they do that is because otherwise you will never see their stuff. You won't. And yes, that is an unsustainable process. I would agree. And that's something that definitely needs to be changed. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of solutions about, marketing, but I do think one thing that you can do if you're a brand is get invested in the slow fashion community on Instagram. Get invested there, because I think Instagram has a lot of amazing communities of people that are into sustainability, into slow fashion, into all sorts of things. And I find the sustainable fashion community of Instagram shows up for brands. And so I think even if you don't have a lot of money, invest in a community and really, really get in there, commenting, leaving notes, getting to know people that are into this stuff. And I think that that's almost as good as putting money into marketing in a lot of ways, because a lot of people buy things through word of mouth. Are you happy with the size of your personal wardrobe? No. Well, so this is the last question I'm going to answer. I literally felt like during the entire pandemic, I was just thinking, why do I have so much clothing? But I think that's the vast majority of us. I'm not exceptionally rich. I do not come from a rich family. I think we have been buying in a way, and we've been told to buy in that way, and it's been completely unhealthy. But no, I have bought less this year. I buy less every single year, and I still look at my wardrobe and think, well, Aja, you have a lot of clothing. So yeah, I think all of us need to just constantly be evaluating the messages that are being sent to us by ways of consumption. That's what I absolutely think. And on that note, I'm going to finish up because the Slow Factory team has things to do. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciated this. All of your questions were really great, and I hope everyone learned a lot. Thank you all so much, and everyone have a really, really great weekend.